Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rola Jawi. I'm an associate professor at CRADLE, and it's such a pleasure to be here chairing this afternoon's session with our two recent PhD graduates, Abbas and Juan. As is with these things, I'm going to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present and those joining us today. And I acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and would like to really thank them for their care of the land. So please do write in the chat where you are joining us from and the lands that you are on, and welcome everyone to this session. And so, as I mentioned, we've got Abbas and Juan, got Dr. Abbas Mehrabi and Juan Fischer Rodriguez joining us. They will be talking about their PhDs respectively, and really around the topic of evaluative judgment. The way this session is going to be structured, I'm going to do now the introductions, and I'm going to invite Abbas to come on. He's going to talk for about 15 minutes. He's going to present some of the findings from his research. I might take a clarifying question or two if there are any, and then we're going to move straight into Juan's presentation. He'll also talk for 15 minutes, and then hopefully that gives us about 20 minutes at the end for discussion. We will wrap things up formally at the hour so that people who have to leave can get to leave, and anyone who wants to stay and ask further questions is more than welcome to. We can push out for another 15 minutes if there are lots of questions. So without further ado, what I might just really quickly also mention for those of you who haven't heard, so the topic is developing students' evaluative judgments, pedagogical activities and practices. If this language of evaluative judgment is new to you, really quickly, it's something that CRADLE has been working on, and it's around the understandings of quality and helping students to come to being able to make judgments about the quality of their own work and that of others. And we really think that it's an important capability around lifelong learning. And what you'll hear from our speakers is how they've operationalized this notion of evaluative judgment in their own research, and then what the pedagogical activities and practices that lead to the development of evaluative judgment for our students. So without further ado, what I'm going to do now is invite Abbas to give us the first talk around pedagogical activities. Thanks so much, Abbas.
Thanks, Rola. Let me just share my screen. Can you see the slides?
Yes, great. Thank you, Abbas. Yep.
Well, in this presentation, we are going to discuss about evaluative judgment, or EJ of academic writing, and how to develop it. I will use EJ hereafter for ease of communication. And but why EJ of academic writing, and why is development of this capability important? Well, research shows that compared to high school writing, academic writing in higher education requires students to be more responsible for their own writing process. And such responsibility includes, for example, students taking initiative to develop their understanding of standards of their particular assignments, and their use of their evaluative skills to critically analyze the work of others in their subject area, or to choose resources such as online materials and peers to monitor and evaluate their writing process. So this means that to help students with a successful academic writing experience, educators need to create a learning environment in which students can exercise and improve their knowledge of assignment standards and evaluative skills. A promising approach that has been offered is to design pedagogical activities in a way that develops students' evaluative judgment. And The question is, why is this approach promising? Because it needs students to actively participate in the activities that require them to create and negotiate information about assessment standards and make judgments on the work of self and others. An example of such activities are co-construction of rubrics, critiquing and analyzing exemplars with others, or peer and self-assessment. So students' active participation in such activities can be a potential way for promoting their agency, where they can take more responsibility for their own writing process. So all this means that, yes, development of evaluative judgment or EJ of academic writing is important. But how can we help students develop this capability? Well, first we need to find out what EJ of academic writing is. I mean, what the components of EJ of academic writing are. And then to explore the type of pedagogical activities that influence development of those components. So in my PhD project, I tried to address both of these questions, but both of these gaps, as there has been no empirical study to explore this area. And my project was comprised of two studies. First, we explored components of EJ of academic writing. And the main research question for this study was, how does evaluative judgment manifest in the first year academic writing context? We then, in the second phase, explored the influence of pedagogical activities. And the research question for this study, for the second study, was which pedagogical activities in the first year contribute to the development of EJ of academic writing? For this talk, I will focus on the second question, I mean the types of activity due to lack of time. But before I move on, just a very brief introduction to the components of EJ of writing that we explored in the first study. What we found actually was that evaluative judgment of academic writing is a capability that underpins three interrelated components: understanding of standards, I mean both generic and genre-specific standards; making judgments, where students make different types of judgments; and taking action, where students use various strategies to apply their learning gains to improve the quality of their assignments. So now let's focus on the second study and the method. Participants were recruited from the discipline of education, 21st students, both male and female. They were all native speakers of English to ensure they are not in the process of learning second language writing, because second language writing and first language writing are very different. And they were recruited from the units in which students had to complete two sequence assessment tasks that were similar or in the same genre. Data were collected through interviews and document analysis. Actually, we conducted two semi-structured interviews, one after their first assignments, once they received teacher feedback on it, and one after their second assignment. And documents such as students' assignments, unit guidelines, and descriptors of assessment tasks were also analyzed. And thematic analysis was used for analyzing the data. So what we found in relation to the types of activities: 4 categories of activities were found to be influential: peer review, group discussion, reflection on performance, and instructor-led intervention. And here I will briefly go through each category. Well, the first category was peer review, and it was one of the most common practices across different units of study that students mentioned helped them improve their knowledge of standards and how to make judgment. Most of the peer review activities took the form of a summative approach, I mean after the students had done their assignments. An example of such activities were structured peer review or rubric-based peer review. In structured peer review, for example, the teacher provided students with few questions, and the students had to analyze their peers' works and provide feedback. And there was also one example of formative peer review activity, which required students weekly evaluation of their peers' drafts before their final work is submitted. And most of the students believe that this activity improved their self-evaluation skills for the next assignment. Students 5, for example, as you can see on the screen, mentioned the benefits of this activity as checking others' work, promoted his thinking. He could see the strengths of other work, check back his own work, and then modify it. And for the next assignment, he did the same thing to ensure his writing is of quality. And the second category, the second category of activities was group discussion, and various discussion-based activities were identified that had influence on students' evaluative judgment. For example, discussion of peer review experience, discussion of weekly topics, or feedback conversations. And one of the values of discussion that students noted was generating ideas. For example, some students noted how they receive new ideas about the structure and introduction from group discussion, which they use in their next assignments. As student 3 said, the class discussion on previous assignments helped him to understand how to be descriptive in the introduction for the next assignment. Another benefit of such activities was that they challenged students to think critically and explain the reason for the comments they had provided on the work of peers. And some of them actually believed that this developed their ability to think about why for making any decision on a piece of work or expressing their thoughts. And reflection on performance was the third category, and here I mean reflection on one's own and others' performance. There were some activities that required the students to either analyze their own work and think about how to improve it in the future experience, or to analyze the work of others and make comparison with their own work. And analyzing unit readings was, for example, an activity in which students needed to analyze the readings provided by unit chair and provided by unit chair and make comparison with their own writing. Self-reflection on writing was another example where teacher provided students with some example questions to ask themselves while writing their assignments. Questions such as, how is my points back up with examples from the text, or do I need to have my own opinion on it, and questions like that. And the benefits of such activities were reported by students to be creating the habit of how to think critically and ask themselves questions in relation to the quality of their next assignments, or their learning of how to make comparison between their own and others' writing and judge the quality of their own work. And you can see in this code that the students believe she had learned how to be critical and judge her own work. And the last category was instructor-led intervention. It is labeled as instructor-led because in previous categories, the focus was on students as active agents in the process of eliciting and using both assessment standards and feedback. But there was some kind of intervention that needed specific actions and practices of the teachers. And two examples of such intervention were teacher preview guide and teacher feedback. In teacher preview guide, for example, the teacher provided a short video in which he spoke about what he needed students to do for each section of the essay. Things like how to make argument, referencing, and whether they can use first person or not. As students noted, such interventions had an immediate learning benefit. They could help students understand the standards of their current assignments, but they had barely improved students' understandings of the standards of subsequent assignments. As the comment of student 6 about teacher feedback shows, the focus of feedback was on correction of errors rather than showing how to improve. And interestingly, none of the students also reported any development in terms of their judgment-making ability. And I think one reason for little or no influence of such activities on a student's EJ might be they didn't engage students in reflection or discussion about the assignment expectations and standards. And so what do all these findings suggest? I think the first key message is that for development of the EJ of academic writing, students need to be provided with opportunities to engage in reflective thinking practices and designing activities that help students reflect on both their own and others' work and make comparisons appear to be of great help, because such activities prompt students to take evaluative actions. They have to compare their own performance with others' performance and check the similarities and differences and things like that. And besides individual reflection, the findings suggest that students' development of their EJ is also a social process, which occurs through their interaction with others, including peers and teachers, to negotiate the meaning of criteria, to clarify misunderstandings, or generate new ideas. One example of such interaction in this study was an activity called discussion of the weekly topic, where students needed to discuss with peers about the assignment criteria and expectations, or to exchange ideas on how to approach the task. Well, that's it on my end about development of EJ of academic writing. And Juan is going to tell us more about the situated aspects that mediate students' judgment making.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Abbas. So nice to see evidence of what the students value in terms of their development of evaluative judgment and what they really attune to. There's a question in the Q&A from Amina, and what I'll do now is just take a couple of really quick questions and then we'll move on to Juan. And she's asking, how important is a sequenced assessment design in students' development of EJ?
Well, what a very good question. Actually, the findings of my project provided an understanding of the types of activity and how they should be designed. And it seems like that the sequence activity would kind of provide opportunities for students to have discussions around sources of quality information, such as rubrics and exemplars, so they can grasp the meaning of criteria and concepts with them. And
it builds in a feedback loop, doesn't it, Abbas, around them being able to actually then do something with the information that they get from peer review, from their discussion and reflection.
The feedback, yeah.
I'll ask another question around why you focused on students with English as their first language, and would a further study looking at EAL standard student experiences be warranted?
Yeah, I think there are quite many differences between the first language writing and second language writing, because students who are learning their second language writing focus more on this on the we call it lower order writing skills, such as how to make structures, how to learn the vocabulary and things like that, which is quite different from those who are in their first writing experience, first language writing experience, who focus on higher order writing skills, such as how to evaluate their writing, how to analyze the works of peers. And this process of first language and second language are quite different. And if you are going to actually explore students' evaluative judgments of second language writing, it might be quite different from first language writing.
Yeah, and so John, perhaps there's more work to be done in that space for sure.
Yeah.
Around that. I might hold the other questions till after, and thank you. Please keep adding them on. I can see the questions are coming up, but at this stage, thank you so much, Abbas, for keeping to time and for the really interesting evidence. And I'm going to pass you all on to Juan, who's going to take a different perspective to the question of evaluative judgment.
Thank you, Rola. You can see my slides there?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to continue talking about evaluative judgment and some form of academic writing, but specifically about physics lab reports. And particularly, I'm going to be exploring the relationship between evaluative judgment and context. The reason why I do that is because evaluative judgment has been defined, when it was defined, it was said to be a discipline-specific capability. And that it's clear, but it's also been described as context dependent. And then there's the question of what do we mean by context? So examples of context usually tend to assume different or distant points in time. So for example, understandings of quality in modern medicine have come a long way from understanding of quality in 1950s. There's also the use of context as the general description of a research, the context of a research. So they talk about the location of the university and the type of cohort. My proposal here is that if we do a focused exploration on that link between context and evaluative judgment, that might help us to reveal aspects beyond individual students that shape, enable, or constrain how they make judgments. And these are aspects, social and material aspects that are beyond the individual and their cognition. And studying this may reveal the tensions between students' actual judgments and the educator's expectations that might be ideal forms of evaluative judgment, but not quite what students actually do. So my PhD had the research question of how does evaluative judgment take place in student practices. And with this question, what I wanted to do was focusing on what students do rather than in the activities. The activities would then be a structuring element of the judgments students make, but my focus was on the students. And for this presentation, I'm going to be talking about another sub-research question that was how does the context enable and constrain student judgments? To do this, I did an ethnographic study with undergraduate physics students between 2019 and 2020. So I had half pandemic, half non-pandemic data collection. I worked with students from all 3 year levels. And I did participant observations on campus during 2019, and then repeated interviews with some of these students throughout the whole project. And both my data collection and analysis was informed by the theory of practice architectures, which I'm going to explain next. So the theory of practice architectures, it's not about architecture. It's a practice theory. It's a social theory that seeks to understand the social world, how it's reproduced and how it changed through focusing on the things that people do in everyday life and in concrete settings. They define practices as, well, it's the unit of analysis of this theory and the other practice theories. And this particular one defines practices as a bundle of the things people say, the things people do, and the way they relate to others. For this presentation, we can take the examples of writing lab reports as a practice. And we can see that when someone or when a student writes a lab report, they do something. They use computers, they type, they collect information. They also say things in the form of text or in the forms of conversation with their peers, with their teachers. And they relate, well, of course, with their peers, with the teachers, but potentially with the final audience of the text. This theory also allows us to question what do we mean or what we understand by context, because it proposes that practices are enabled or constrained by the practice architectures. Practice architectures are three types of arrangements, understood as the cultural discursive arrangements, which have to do the language that enables what people can say or limits what people can say. The economic material arrangements that have to do with objects, artifacts, time, space, that affects the possibilities of how people do things, and the social political arrangements, which have to do with hierarchies, with roles, networks, power, solidarity, that affects the way people interact. So we can see that writing reports occurs within a complex view on context, even though the theorists that develop this theory don't like the word context because they consider it too shallow and usually used as a backdrop. So what I'm doing here is using the theory of practice architecture to explore how context taken seriously prefigures or enables and constrains students' judgments on laboratory lab reports. And this is how the context shapes what they consider a good report and how to do a good report. So if we talk about the cultural discursive arrangements, the language, we can easily think about standards and assessment criteria. This is the language of quality. This is the language we use to describe quality. And it's, of course, related to specific disciplines, but it's also local. It is also enacted differently in specific contexts. And in this case, we have that similar descriptors of quality in a rubric are applied very differently throughout different year levels, even though they are all describing the quality of a lab report. This quality varies from first to third year, meaning that those standards are reinterpreted, but also they are not quite transparent. And here we have Steve talking about one of his reports. They had to propose improvements to the experiment that they ran. And he said that if you have a detailed improvement, it's generally a paragraph, but if you have very specific ones, then you might need like 3 or 4 of them. But he describes this as fairly subjective because there's not an exact thing on the rubric that tells you what is a deep improvement or a shallow one. Then there's discourses about assessment. Usually when we talk about what is being assessed, it's often equated to what it's marked. And we have here Steve again talking about a hand-drawn diagram that he included in his report. It was quite ugly. And he said that, well, he thought that he knew they wouldn't like it, the examiners, but he wasn't sure how much they wouldn't. So he didn't know how many marks he would lose. He decided that it was good enough. And he actually got good comments throughout the whole task, pretty much passed, but he just lost some marks on hand-drawn diagram. And then there's a thing about language, in this case, the language of the discipline as the disciplinary knowledge. Here we have Malcolm talking about within an activity of analyzing an exemplar. They were asked if the caption of a graph was too short, if it was enough, or too long, too much information. And he said that he just couldn't decide if it was good enough because he didn't understand the theory behind it. And what this shows is that evaluative judgment is not just about some generic criteria, but it's also about the knowledge itself of the discipline. It's about the things people know and do within the discipline. If we talk about material economic arrangements, students make judgments with artifacts. And in the literature, we have talked about using rubrics and exemplars. Yes, but I'm not going to talk about that now. I'm talking about Ian, for example, using specialized data analysis and visualization software to evaluate the data he received from teachers. And he runs a complex analysis and he sees that the curve with the data doesn't fit the expected values. He's using complex software to evaluate someone else's data that he was using for his report, and actually the data he was provided was wrong, but he couldn't have done this analysis just by looking at what quality looks like. He needed to run this analysis. And in the case of Steve, he talks about coding, because when students write the report, they need to write or do they need to code diagrams. They need to present their data with codes, or they use LaTeX to prepare good-looking reports. And he says that when the code is wrong, you can see that the line is bendy, the points are all over the place, and you can check the alignment of titles and units, meaning that the software is telling them something. But what I'm talking about here is not automatic feedback. It is not pre-programmed comments about quality. It is more about the world biting back. Students do something, the software reacts and gives them some information, and it's students or the user who needs to interpret what those problems mean. A student, in the case of Ian, could have just decided that the graph said what it said and prepared the report, but Ian was interpreting that graph as there is a problem with the data. And then we have issues with time constraints. Ian, for example, described that when you're short on time, you're stuck on a problem. When you're working with your data, you have to submit the report soon, you have a very few days and you get stressed and you're not thinking about solutions, you're just thinking about the problem, which limits the evaluation and the decisions that students can make. And then Steve, talking again about the hand-drawn diagram, he said that he knew you should do diagrams properly, but he was very short on time. He decided they might take a couple of marks, but it would just take too long to do it nicely in a computer. He told me he thought maybe doing it on Paint. I would have used PowerPoint, but that he was making decisions about his own digital skills and the little time he had, and he decided a hand-drawn diagram, it's good enough for this task. Then if we talk about sociopolitical arrangements, this first bit was more obvious on another piece of data, which was students discussing about physics problems. And what I saw there was that when they are working with others, judgments or evaluative judgments are emerging. That is, students don't engage necessarily in a peer feedback activity. They are working together. They are talking, they are discussing, and in their questions, discussions, they bring artifacts, they bring their previous knowledge, and then they make judgments that emerge from the conversation. But also making judgment with others involved. Now, again, in the case of writing reports, these students would be sharing data, double-checking code, making sure that the more tech part of the report is working well. But interestingly, there was no peer review of the actual writing. And this had to do with working against the deadline, little time to read each other's work, but also one of them commented that when you share data, well, it's easy to just double check code or share the data and it's not plagiarizing, but if you go and read someone else's work, someone else's actual writing, then you can't copy that. And then in terms of making judgment with others, there were also more anecdotes about learning from or with the family. And Malcolm told me he was helping his younger sister writing a chemistry report for VCE. And she had to propose improvements to her experiment. And he decided, oh, this is something that I can do in first year physics too. But also Ian talking with his dad about the kind of feedback he receives and what is actionable feedback and what is feedback that I can use on another task. If it's about this sentence that it's not clear, well, that doesn't help me for the next assignment. And then if we talk about positioning power relationships, we see that Nita, for example, during an exemplar analysis task, when they had to mark an exemplar with a rubric, she said, isn't this the job of lecturers? Kind of saying, showing that there's people who are allowed to make judgments, whereas that thing of peer feedback is not necessarily considered feedback. Or also Ian talking about not knowing when to ask help because he fears that teachers might think you're not really trying, that they will be correcting the work before it's submitted. So to summarize what I've just presented, what I showed you here is that when students make evaluative judgments, when they decide what is quality or what is good enough work, they do things with artifacts, they do things with others, and they use their knowledge of the standards and the discipline itself to make those judgments. So it's not just free-floating definitions of quality, but it's local, situated context that enables students making decisions one way or another. And now just to close this presentation, what this work showed me was that evaluative judgment could be considered as, first, a complex capability that involves more than understanding and applying standards. And this is, it includes, or it involves many contextual aspects beyond the individual to make certain evaluative judgment. Second, evaluative judgment is made on finished work, on a finished report, but it's also about how to produce said work. And those are decisions that students make as they are writing. And some are technical and some are more about writing. Finally, evaluative judgment can be seen as something beyond knowing quality when I see it. And perhaps it might include being able to ask oneself or ask somebody else, how can we know quality in this situation? What is quality right here? And how can we improve our work within the current resources, within the current conditions that we have at hand? And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Juan. Yeah, I agree with Amina's summary. Lots of overlaps with the previous presentation from Abbas about really evaluative judgment being evaluative judgment of something and the need for it to be a social endeavor. I'll start with a couple of questions specifically for you and then perhaps open up the discussion more broadly. Also from Amina, she's asking how you think evaluative judgment impacts students' transitions into the workplace or for this particular, discipline.
I think it might affect them greatly. This is a part of my thesis that I didn't show today, but one of the arguments that I put forward was that if learning is situated, students are learning a discipline, in this case physics, or any other discipline, they are learning that through their student practices. So a lot of the things they are learning are to be a student. It's just, it happens that being a student involves using the language of a discipline. So in this case, using physics theories. It involves doing some of the things of the discipline, maybe running experiments and lab reports. However, the way people design experiments during the undergrad of physics, it's very different from what they do in a research career. Designing is not something that they do so much in undergraduate. Then there's, I mentioned a few times what it's good enough. And I think that it's a important issue, because in educational settings, when we work with grades and marks, we usually have maybe 50% it's a pass. And we, as educators, we might think, oh, well, if you just pass, you're mediocre or something, but that's still saying this is good enough. So if a student wants to get HD, but only gets pass all the time, at the end of the day, they can graduate in certain degrees, not in others. So what we define as good enough might have an important effect on students' transition, because when they go to other places, maybe good enough needs to be way higher. So I think it is very important.
That's really interesting, Juan, about standards. I mean, what it says to me is how complex what we assume around, how much we assume in terms of transfer, and how little we support transitions in terms of translational work, or having mentors in the workplace who help to transform some of the understandings of standards and quality to the specific contexts in which they are working in. And it really, it suggests that actually a lot more work needs to be done around this, the understanding of how practices as students differ from practices in the workplace.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, that being a student, you are, when you are in higher ed, you're positioned as a student vis-a-vis assessment.
Yeah.
I've got another question, and then Abbas, I'll invite you into the discussion. So Juan, Damien's asking about students being obsessed with avoiding accusations of plagiarism, and they won't look at each other's work. How do you reconcile this risk with learning with and from others? And actually, Abbas, you could come in as well. Did anyone speak about this in their interviews? How do we make space for peer learning, for evaluative judgment, given these concerns?
It is quite difficult, because I guess in the case of these students, they are writing the same report about the same experiment. So it might be a bit tricky if I send my text to someone else, will they copy me and get in trouble? But perhaps if they were sharing with different experiments, students from that were doing different experiments, that might maybe work. I think even though my work focused on what students actually do, and that involves within the classroom or outside the classroom, I still think that what teachers do, it's important in terms of what they say and the activities they design. If they are structuring students, they can help to put forward a conversation in terms of it is good to talk with others. It is good to maybe not always know what quality looks like, and that's why you go to a peer and ask, hey, what do you think about this? And the other thing is that when we talk about peer feedback or peer reviews, there might be some resistance from students. And in this case, in my own experience, I've heard that from students who are academics doing professional development. So this happens across the board. Oh, peer review, I don't know, what am I allowed? Should I do it? But then informally, people are asking questions to each other all the time. They are bouncing ideas. So there is some forms of informal peer review or peer feedback going on. And these students would do it in the section of like working out physics problems. They would get together, work with each other. They would say, this doesn't make sense. And they would argue with each other and then come with a solution, meaning that there is a space for legitimizing peer feedback as a practice that people already engage in, but maybe they could engage in more sophisticated ways.
I mean, yeah, so really what you're talking about there is a lot better assessment literacy for our students in terms of where our expectations lie and how we can help, you know, how you might go about approaching the task and what can we structure for them or signpost for them that would help them with their learning.
Yeah.
Abbas, I don't know if you want to say anything more about peer learning in the sense of, did anyone, you know, were your students forthcoming around peer learning? Were the designs, I think in your research, these pedagogical activities of peer learning were formally structured in and designed in to the unit of study, is that correct?
Yeah, actually the prior research shows that first-year students actually have a lack of skills in reviewing others' their peers' works and self-assessment skills. But actually, this was not the case in my PhD project because most of the students were able to review their peers' drafts and provide comments and make comparisons between their own work and the others' work and the peers' works. And actually, it's kind of such kind of peer review activities actually prove to be helpful in developing students' evaluative skills in particular, because students were able to kind of make comparisons and develop their understandings of assessment standards.
And it goes back to that thing about the doing. It happens in the doing. You have to give it a go, and then when you talk about it,
Yeah, exactly.
that the standard, the enactment of the standard really helps you to actually be able to talk about it, but then to implement what you're talking about back into what it is you're doing. I've got a question from Dave, and I'm going to pose it to you both, starting with you, Abbas. Dave asks, you know, you talked about the strategies broadly around peer review, group discussion, reflection. What is crucial in making them have an impact?
Well, I think reflective thinking and discussion of meaning are two factors that made such activities influential. In terms of reflection, for example, particular attention was on individual and social practice that prompt students' reflexivity and encourage negotiation with regards to explicit and implicit standards. Analyzing others' texts or reflecting on a previous draft of their own work and reasoning of peer feedback provided and the judgment made are kind of example practices actually that prove to be helpful in this regard. I think another crucial element was that the activity also needed to include an element of discussion, and I think they need to provide opportunities for students to have discussion around sources of quality information such as rubrics and exemplars, so they can grasp the meaning of criteria and concepts within them. Analyzing unit readings, for example, was an activity wherein the students, in my study, students were required to reflect on and analyze examples of similar works. However, as the students reported, there was not any formal session allocated to the discussion of readings, so students could share their ideas with peers or check their understanding of the concepts and the meaning within them with the teacher. So this means that while reflection on performance or peer review activities are important, actually teachers should design such activities in a way that encourages students' discussion as well. And This can include discussion of their peer review experiences or discussion around the reasons they have provided feedback on peers' work and such kind of discussion between students.
So that speaks to also fostering staff assessment literacy, doesn't it? If these sorts of processes need to be built in, and by virtue of the fact that you chose units of study that already had sequenced assignments in them, would suggest that there was a focus towards kind of the feedback loops and the sense making that is necessary in those activities. I'm going to pose the same question to you, Juan, but a bit differently around, I mean, you know, if we want to promote students' development of evaluative judgment around lab writing or reports, is there something crucial about how you might design that activity to have an impact?
Yes, I think I have a hidden slide here that I would like to share. I think this was a series of writing workshops that I saw in second year. I found this was very interesting because it was 5 tasks in one. Well, 5 tasks throughout the semester, meaning they first have one about sections of a report, and it's not only teachers describing, but they pose questions to students, and students evaluate the quality of very short examples of sections. And there, I saw enough time to say, oh, I don't understand this. Oh, this was when Malcolm said, I don't know, I need the theory. Then that moves to students need to write a draft. So there is a little bit of enacting quality. And some people don't like to use exemplars because students might copy them. And that did happen in first year. But students do the report draft before they do the analysis of exemplars. And then they discuss, oh, this is good, my work was worse. And then they use the rubric, and that gives time to discussion. And what I found interesting in this activity is that some of the discussions were around what software can one use to write a nice looking paper. And the teacher said, oh, I use LaTeX. It could have been more explored and more embedded into the design of the activity or the degree, but there were conversations that are beyond the standards of quality. And in this sequence, then teachers comment on students' draft after the analysis of exemplars. And it's only then when students submit the report again with a cover letter talking about how they address the comments. So what I see here is that there is a back and forth between criteria and enactment and comments and enactment. So I found this, I think a sequence is important because it allows this back and forth. And this takes a long time, yes, but students submitted this report like in week 7 or 8. It was very late, but it's fine. Students had a long time to work on that. And then they had a second report that was submitted like very few weeks after. So that has a lot more pressure. But what they were doing was front loading the feedback, even though it wasn't always called feedback. I feel that there was feedback all around this, not just on the comments on the text. And just as a quick anecdote, during first year, Malcolm told me about a peer review task in the classroom that was not part of this sequence. And he told me that everyone had to bring their draft, but in his table, nobody had used it. Nobody had finished the draft, so they used the task to finish it there. So what that says is that when we design the activity, it's not just what we ask students to do, but we need to pay attention to the conditions in the classroom or online that might allow students to do the things that we don't want to do, we don't want them to do, or maybe help them to do things in more productive ways. So again, thinking about the architectures of student practices.
And that ties in really nicely actually to a question from Jeanette, and they're asking about the idea of cultivating contextual agility that preserves evaluative judgment capability in different settings. She's interested in what your project says about the scaffolding we might want to consider for will and internships at higher levels, such as PhDs.
Yeah, I think I might not have the solution at hand, because what I found with my project is that this is a very complex topic. However, because we're thinking about transitions, we're thinking about going from maybe classroom learning to work integrated learning to then full professional practice, I think the idea of transferring, it's important, but it needs to be properly discussed. And when I think about transferring, people tend to talk about transferring skills as things that you just move in different contexts, but I think that transferring needs learning. So when students move from one context to another, they bring their experiences, but they need to learn to adapt. They need to learn new things to reconcile their previous experience with their new ones. And I think paying attention to that kind of learning could be important. So we, I think it should be important to support students identifying standards of quality rather than just providing them to them. Students might need to come and figure out, if this is what we're doing, what are the indicators that this is working well? So if we're designing a project, they might need to come with their own evaluation of the project. If you're proposing to design a machine that does certain thing, you should also tell us when that machine shows that it's working or when it's not working, and if that happens, what. So it's this getting used to trying to figure out, and it might sound like problem solving, but I don't like to use any of those generic skill labels, but it's getting used to figure things out. And that also involves feedback literacy, knowing when you need to ask someone else and who you need to ask, because when you move from one context to another, you need to learn from the people who are already there. So I think those things are important, both in undergraduate studies and probably in professional work.
Yeah, and so what you're saying there is actually, rather than transfer, we need to think about it as transformation, because it's never a clean transfer.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, it's evaluative judgment of something, and the context always interplays with that. But it's a really interesting question, and the theory of practice architectures, I would suggest, perhaps doesn't align well with contextual agility as a notion.
Yeah,
because you have to take account of the specific architectures that are at play each and always every time. But it's really interesting, Jeanette, and I don't know if it's similar to epistemic fluency, which is something that Peter Goodyear's team also look into. But it just leaves me wondering quite a bit about how much what it is we can do to set people up for their future careers and for the workplace. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to wrap up formal proceedings now, and then we can, get back to some of the questions in the Q&A. I do want to thank our two speakers tremendously for their. It's such a difficult task to synthesize 3 to 3.5 years of work and a full PhD into a 15-minute talk. So well done to both of you. It really is difficult to take all those multiple threads and to give a coherent narrative for what you did and why you did it. And you did that really well, so thank you. I want to also just mention that our next CRADLE research seminar is looking at a theory for academic integrity research. It's by Dr. Guy Curtis from the University of Western Australia, and it's on the 12th of July. So if you, you'll be getting our emails if you're here, so just watch out for that. I think it looks like a really interesting seminar. So thank you for those of you who are leaving us now, and for those of you who want to stay on, please feel free to add more questions to the Q&A. Abbas, I've got a couple of quick clarifying questions for you. The question is a question from Gloria about whether you mainly use students' perceptions of what helped, or did you rely on other forms of evidence for the development of evaluative judgment?
Well, actually, we tried to measure the effects of activities on students' learning of both standards and making judgment, as well as taking actions. And we did it through exploring the learning mechanisms that are activated when students engage in such activities. I mean, how students learn to make judgments or understand standards rather than what they learn. So we use open-ended questions, such as, can you walk me through the steps you took in doing this activity? What were you looking for when you were doing that, and kind of what did you learn? Can you give me an example of what you learned, and what did you do after that? So this kind of question actually help us to measure students' progress from task one to subsequent tasks. But one limitation of my study was that we measured the learning effects of these activities in a short period of time, and I see long-term data is needed to determine the lasting effects of the type of activity explored in this study or other activities. And to determine this, I think a longitudinal study with in-depth interviews over the duration of a course or program of study, so which students reflect upon their learning experiences, is needed. And this can kind of confirm or reject the students' progress in their evaluative judgment of academic writing over time. And yeah, we just measured the students actually. It was all through the students' reports, and we just measured the effects of the activities on students' evaluative judgments through students' reports.
Yeah, in relation to their assignments, yeah, as you said, they're very situated type of questions in the interviews. And did the courses you used, Abbas, were they about writing, or was writing a genre of assessment?
Oh, no, the courses were not about writing, actually. There were three kinds of courses that we used, and that we recruited students from there, and they were all from discipline of education, and we were just looking for those kind of courses or those kind of units in which students had to complete 2 sequence assessment tasks, 2 sequence writing assignments. So yeah, that were the kind of courses that.
And academic writing is such a dominant genre, and we know from the literature that first-year students really struggle with it moving in from higher education into university, and struggle with the pedantry and the academic standards around referencing, etc. But these were courses that really did favour writing in the assessments, and that had the sequenced activities within them, and that was part of the purpose of sampling. Got a question there from Stefan around lab reports. Can you see that question there, Juan? Is there anything you want to add to that?
If the lab reports were aligned with the lab task, I think they were. I do agree that the lab reports students write on their own experiments. Sometimes were very basic, especially in first year. It was interesting that this particular Department of Physics is moving away from demonstrations and stuff, and students have very sometimes very vague instructions of what to do in the experiment. But I do agree that when they're writing about capacitance, the report it's very basic because it is a very well-known physical phenomenon. I even learned about capacitance when I was in the lab with students. But those reports start getting more complex when they go through second year and third year. I did observe a qualitative experiment, and it was about how light reflects on this specific type of beetle. And yeah, students were having a difficult time because they don't know what to measure, they don't know what to write about, but that was kind of the challenge of the activity, that they need to explore a phenomenon qualitatively. But yeah, I think there are some limitations in that kind of reports. And I guess that it's a bit of a shame that it's only in honors when students start doing more complex type of reports and designing experiments. But I also think that at some point it's important to scaffold students. Something I didn't mention is students need to write logbooks during the lab and then reports. But in first year, the course have emphasized in first semester, they only write logbooks of the experiments. And it's in the second semester of first year when they, okay, you do logbooks by default. We're not gonna mark you there, but now you have to use those logbooks for writing the reports. And there's a lot of things to improve in the design I saw in first year, but I think that scaffolding started to make sense to me.
And it hits on that spiral curriculum where you revisit something in a more complex way.
Yeah.
Over the trajectory of your learning. But I am struck by the notion of how obscure the standards are when you first start trying to do something. I mean, that's the reality of being a novice and being in a new space.
Yeah.
So in the absence of further questions, I'm going to wrap up by asking you to tell me, what are your top 2 recommendations for developing students' evaluative judgment based on your work? Who wants to go first? Do you want to go, Abbas?
Yes, I think engagement of students in reflective thinking and discussion-based activities would be kind of, I think, the best suggestion I would give based on my PhD findings. Actually, the findings of my project provided an understanding of the types of activities and how they should be designed. But I mean, I introduced the type of activities, but we should keep in mind that developing evaluative judgment is not only a matter of introducing a set of assessment and feedback activities to a particular unit. I think it involves a kind of new focus on the structure of courses. I mean, the courses should be structured in a way that focus on the focus is mostly on formative purposes of assessment activities and feedback. And this kind of will ensure that we create opportunity for students to actively engage in reflecting on textual resources or discussing with human resources and using those resources actually to understand assessment standards and make judgment. And obviously, to place the focus on formative purposes of assessment, teacher assessment literacy is of prime concern. I would like to highlight the teacher assessment literacy because teachers need to know how to design and implement formative activities or what type of feedback and how to provide them. And I think to support teacher assessment literacy, individual faculties, one solution is for individual faculties to kind of organize professional development activities professional development courses, actually, with the focus on improving knowledge and skills of teachers on how to employ formative assessment in particular contexts. And such courses can include, for example, topics such as student-centered dialogic approaches toward assessment transparency, using assessment rubrics and exemplars, or how to design and implement peer and self-assessment activities, and how to provide quality feedback. I think this kind of, a teacher needs this kind of knowledge and assessment literacy.
Thank you, Abbas. That sounds like a lot of things. And Juan, any thoughts from you?
Yes, programmatic assessment. I think that yeah, we need to think ways in which individual units stop being individual units and more something that builds into the subsequent units. Yeah, because even when we sometimes we think about scaffolding the activities that happen in one semester, then the next becomes a bit more complex. That is useful, but there's always breaks that are very artificial in terms of learning, because learning it's an evolving process. And I see that Rebecca asked a question about extrinsic and intrinsic learning, but when we have short courses where you have to pass or fail, the formative activities that support evaluative judgment are still useful and important, but we have the pressure of, no, I need to pass, I need to finish this. So even if we have motivated students, and I think the students I interviewed were very committed to their work, to their learning, and to physics, it was lovely to talk to them because they would get excited talking about physics. And I sometimes regret not going into this hard science path. So I was also excited talking with them. But even when they are intrinsically motivated, they have the pressure of, I have to submit this assignment by this day. I have to pass, and I have to finish the end of the semester. So we live in a rush that might be counterproductive towards student learning. So I think that programmatic approaches that allows to collect a lot of different forms of data about students learning, and then allows us to make more rigorous decisions about their learning. They might be more productive to introduce activities that support evaluative judgment, because the emphasis here is on learning and not on marking and passing, and not on the bureaucracy of education.
Thank you. Well, thank you both. And I hope, Rebecca, that's kind of touched on your question around good enough and whether that's too shortcutting, and how it aligns with extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. And I'm not sure that there is any research around that. So, you know, that there's a lot of work to be done in this space, but it's sounding like assessment literacy and programmatic assessment are two pathways for moving forwards in terms of developing students' evaluative judgment. I hope we've given you some ideas around how this, how you could take back to your own workplace and possibly new research agendas. Abbas and Juan would be very happy to answer questions if you want to drop them specific emails. And of course, the CRADLE staff are all here as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, and wishing you a very good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.